This is my first game jam, so good thing the rules are pretty simple. You have 48 hours to make a game. Any art in the game has to be from the art pack provided. So first things first, what do I make? I downloaded the art pack and opened it. There's a lot to work with. I looked over the tiles that I had to work with. I stared deep into its orbs, its flowing rivers, roads, tracks, and castle walls. Then, upon seeing its wide selection of fantasy people and monsters, I knew what I was gonna make. I'm gonna make chess. Yeah, no, I actually went with that. Okay, I'm gonna have to do a little more than just chess. I want to do something with the chess pieces, but I also want some originality. The obvious thing to make with the tiles would be a dungeon, so I thought I would make some sort of chess-themed dungeon crawler. The idea is that you play as chess pieces with normal chess piece type movement, but there will also be enemies like goblins and skeletons that move in real time and try to attack you and your king. If I had time, I also wanted to add an item like a sword that would kill enemies or a shield that would prevent them from hurting you. I need an objective, and I want to have it have something to do with chess. So how about you have to save the king? Stop any enemies from hurting it, and take it out of the dungeon, escort it to safety. That also gave me a great idea for the name. How about Chesscourt mission? I know. Idea seemed good enough, so I got to work. I created a new project in Godot and brought in the assets. The levels and decals could just use a tile map based on the original image, but I wanted separate image files for the characters, so I cut them out in Sprite. I put together a basic scene and started working on game logic. I made two important decisions here that would really affect the rest of development for better or for worse. The first was how I dealt with moving a piece. The obvious way to do things, and what most chess games do, would be to make a list of every valid move and to highlight each space you could move to. Instead, I sort of took the easy way out and made a function that determines whether or not a given move is valid. I just put an icon under the mouse to show if you could move to where you were pointing or if you weren't able to. This was easier than the alternative, but it certainly made things less intuitive and meant you basically had to know how to play chess already if you wanted to have any idea what was going on. The other, far more grave mistake I made was collision. Every chess piece, with the exception of the knight, can only move in a straight line every turn, so I made the collision check a line from your current position to the position you want to move to. Problem is, the corner would end up blocking diagonal pieces. So, instead of making normal collisions, every tile's hitboxes had to be just a tiny bit smaller so that they didn't cover the corners. This let diagonal pieces just slip through without triggering a collision. The other problem with this is that Godot can only detect one collision along a line. That meant that if I had some object with collision, but that wasn't a wall, and then had a wall past it, the collision trace would just totally ignore the wall and only detect the first object. I ended up making a workaround for this, but it's pretty messy and I'm not proud of it, so I'm not going to explain it. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves though. Since those problems didn't end up being an issue until later, the first few hours actually went really smoothly. I got all the pieces put in and working fairly quickly, and got ready to put together some simple levels. An important mechanic I had in mind basically from the beginning was upgrading. In chess, normal chess, if you manage to get a pawn all the way to the end of the board, you can upgrade it. You get to choose what piece to replace the pawn with, basically anything that's not a king. You can choose a rook or a bishop, but no one would ever do that because you can also choose a queen, which is objectively better. So instead of having some sort of upgrade menu, I made the pawn just automatically become a queen when it reaches the end of the board, or in this case, the ceiling of the board. There's actually one option I forgot about, the knight, which can actually do things a queen can't. Leaving this out was a total accident, but I actually think it was the right choice. It makes things simpler and prevents players from being confused. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves though. Since those problems didn't end up being an issue until later, the first few hours actually went really smoothly. I got all the pieces put in and working fairly quickly, and got ready to put together some simple levels. An important mechanic I had in mind basically from the beginning was upgrading. In chess, normal chess, if you manage to get a pawn all the way to the end of the board, you can upgrade it. You get to choose what piece to replace the pawn with, basically anything that's not a king. You can choose a rook or a bishop, but no one would ever do that because you can also choose a queen, which is objectively better. So instead of having some sort of upgrade menu, I made the pawn just automatically become a queen when it reaches the end of the board, or in this case, the ceiling of the board. There's actually one option I forgot about, the knight, which can actually do things a queen can't. Leaving this out was a total accident, but I actually think it was the right choice. It makes things simpler and prevents players from being confused. When putting together the first few levels, I wanted a way to prevent upgrading to keep things simple for new players. There were some spikes in the art pack and it fit the theme, so I added in spikes that would just destroy any piece that touches them. Instead of checking for spikes along the line of the move, I decided they'd only hurt if you actually landed on them. This would let me build puzzles around moving over the spikes, and differentiate pieces like a queen, that could move over the spikes, from pieces like a king, that can't and can only move one space at a time. With just these mechanics, I had enough to make a few introductory puzzles, more than I was planning actually, around just the very basic mechanics. After making about 5 levels, I decided it was time to introduce upgrading. I made a level where the only thing the player could do was slowly move the pawn forward until it reached the ceiling and upgraded into a queen. Then there was a little puzzle where you had to use the queen to get the king out and bring it to the finish. I put some other pieces in too to look like everyone was trapped in the dungeon and the queen was there to save the day. Later I ended up adding some narration and text to make the whole scene a little more dramatic. I made a few levels with the upgrade mechanic. At this point I was approaching 10 levels and it was about time to add in the real-time elements. There was a problem though. This was fun. This was actually a good game already. And I felt like adding in most of what I intended to would turn it into something else, something potentially less enjoyable. So I pretty easily made the decision to just keep going with this and to make the game entirely turn-based. There were still a few mechanics I had planned that would still work with a new direction, so I went about adding them. First was barriers. You could capture them with a piece to break them. Until they were broken, they would work like a wall. These were initially meant to hold back enemies, but they ended up making for some interesting puzzles revolving around holding back a pawn. A bit later, I added in keys and doors. When you capture a key, sort of like a piece, you swap places with it. Get the key next to a door and the door will open up, letting you past. This ended up making for some interesting puzzles where you maneuver a key in tight spaces. Things were going great, and once I got to level 10, I decided to make a world too. I changed up the color scheme and used different tiles, also from the art pack, and it actually came together pretty quickly. I made another element, a bridge that only lets you cross it once before breaking, and I was back to designing new and interesting puzzles. It was about at this point I realized I really needed an undo feature. I already had a way to reset the level completely, but with these new, complex and difficult puzzles, once I got to wasn't really going to cut it. I hastily made every element just inherit from a parent class and use a shared set of variables, just an x and y position on the grid and 2 more variables to store the state of the object. I made the player controller send out a signal to every other object that saves the object's state whenever you move, and I made pieces dying be a state change rather than the object actually getting deleted. Then when you press the undo button, I just made every object revert to its most recent set of state variables. And honestly, this just kinda worked. Apart from some very minor glitches, the undo system just worked like a charm. I honestly expected it to be way more difficult, but I really don't regret adding this. Honestly, without it, I think the game would have been pretty much unplayable. From this point on, it was pretty much just adding levels. Once I got to level 20, I added in a little end screen, and I still actually had a lot of time left. So I decided to make a secret world. I still had some ideas left that I really wanted to try out, but I felt like I had a very good length for a game, and it was already difficult enough, so if I made it a secret, people wouldn't feel like they would have to finish it, at least hopefully. Starting the secret world was very similar to the second world. Just grabbed in some new assets from the art pack, got a new color scheme, and got to work. For this world's introductory mechanic, I wanted to have conveyor belts that would move pieces. I put together a new object and made it so that whenever a piece overlapped with it, the piece that was overlapping would end up being given an offset in its x and y coordinates, so functionally it would move the piece. This worked, but it wasn't perfect. For example, the conveyor belts could push pieces through walls or into other pieces. I ended up just deciding this was fine and working around it. Once I had a few levels with the conveyor belt, I got to what I really wanted to add to the secret world. The alien. The alien was another piece, but not one native to the world of chess. It could move one piece diagonally, sort of like a pawn every turn, except for it to capture, it actually had to go over another piece. This was the most complicated piece to add, but not by a whole lot, and since I'd already added the other pieces, it didn't take too long to add. I also added a mechanic where the alien could upgrade, sort of similar to a pawn. This new piece was enough to inspire me to make a bunch of new puzzles, enough to reach the count of 30. However, I still wasn't super happy with the final puzzle of the normal game, so I went back and designed a new one. I really liked the new puzzle, so I ended up also making a separate, harder version of it for the secret world. This brought my total level count to 32. Pretty happy with what I'd made so far. I took a break. What I haven't mentioned is that this game jam, unlike most, doesn't actually make you count breaks as part of your time. The time limit was 48 hours, and timing myself actually developing, I only used about 36 of those. That being said, I didn't want to get caught up with feature creep, a common problem with indie games where you constantly add new features until the game becomes impossible to complete in any reasonable amount of time. So I decided that was just the amount of levels I would have. It was already more than you might expect for a jam game anyways, and I would just take some time to finish polishing up the game and adding in music and sound effects since currently the game was entirely silent. I made a screen, making the title of the game in big letters made out of different tiles that were included in the art pack, and I also added in a save game feature. It ended up being simpler than I thought, because all I needed to do was save the number of the last level you completed. Saving would just happen automatically when you beat a level, and there would be continue and level select buttons on the title screen. I also added in a cheat code where if you press the letters M, I, and Z, all the levels would unlock. Now it was time for sound. I used a program called BFXR to generate sound effects for dying, breaking a bridge, breaking a barrier, opening a door, undoing, and just moving a piece. I used Audacity to edit them and add a little bit of reverb. Then it was time for the music. I can't make music myself, so I had to find royalty-free tracks online. My go-to place is the website No Copyright Sound. They have a lot of genuinely good music that's totally free to use. I found a couple of tracks there, but nothing really fit the tone of what I wanted to do outside of the secret world, so I had to look elsewhere. I ended up finding this guy in SoundCloud whose name I am not even going to attempt to pronounce, who had a couple of free songs that fit what I was trying to do perfectly. I threw them in the game and made them loop. I had the song that gets played be decided by the level you are on. One song for all the levels in the first world, one for the second, and one for the secret. And with that, I was done. I built the game and uploaded it to itch, making a web build available. I wanted it to be playable in browser so people could just try it out easily. Thankfully, Godot's saving seemed to actually work perfectly fine in browser, so people playing the web build didn't actually have to restart every time they reloaded the page. Nice. I was really satisfied with what I made, honestly. I called up my partner on Discord and sent them the game. Turns out they enjoyed it too. But there were some problems. One of the levels in the second world that used the breaking bridges had a problem. I forgot to visually put water under the bridges, so it looked like you should have been able to walk across even when they were broken. I put some water there to fix the issue, but in the process I ended up slightly changing the layout of the level in a way that actually made it impossible. I fixed that too, and it turns out some of the later levels also had collision problems. I fixed those, one by one, very frustrated. Then it came to one of the very last levels. This was the level I mentioned earlier, that's a different version of the final normal level. I knew this puzzle was very difficult, and I tested it right before uploading. You can actually see it in my footage, so I was sure it was possible. I tried at it with my partner for a couple of hours, and I wasn't able to figure it out. I was incredibly confused, but since I still had some time left on my timer, I was able to patch it. I decided I'd just make it easier, because if it takes me, the creator, 3 hours, then something's wrong. However, I was still really confused. I went back to my footage to see if I could figure out how I beat it, and to my surprise, right before building the game, the layout of the level was actually different. I'm not sure how it happened, but that meant that at some point between building the game and uploading it, the file got corrupted and the level's layout actually changed. This was incredibly bizarre, but I changed the level back. However, I was worried this might have affected another level, so I played through the game completely, which took me a while. Okay, so now it actually worked. I still think the game is really good, especially now that it's possible, and it was time for other people to play it. Understandably, I didn't get many views while the game jam was still running. Even though I submitted early, other people were probably busy finishing up their own projects. As of recording, it's the last day of judging, and well, people liked it. A lot of people, actually. I was expecting to do alright, but I wasn't expecting this level of traction. I'm so glad it went so well, and thanks to everyone who's tried it, I really appreciate it. This was my first game jam, and honestly, it really went great. There were a few common complaints, mainly to do with the difficulty curve at the beginning of the game, and I agree with those. By the time Judgment ends, and probably by the time you're watching this video, I'll have released an updated version of the game that fixes some of these problems. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you check out the game. I don't really upload often, or at all so far, but if you like this video, I promise anything after you'll probably like too. Quality can only go up from here. Thanks for watching.